Everybody, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the next episode of our TREATS talks, the Translational Research Ethics Applied Topics talks. These are offered to you from the Center for Bioethics at IU and the Bioethics and Participant Advocacy Program of the Indiana CTSI. And in these talks, we try to cover topics that researchers are probably confronting and may have even asked us for help with. And this is a talk which actually, an earlier version of it, Dr. Madeira gave a couple of years ago about advocacy and research and how to balance those two roles. And we thought it was time to revisit this and have Professor Madeira give us her updates and her thoughts as it relates to topics in the news right now. Since her last talk, we've had COVID and we've had the abortion debate in its new form after Dobbs. And so I'm really excited to hear what Professor Madeira has to say, and I just received her slides, which is perfect then. So I will share my screen, and without further ado, let me hand it over to Dr. Madeira while I fumble here for a second. She's handed off the fumbling from her to me, so I get to fumble instead of her, but I'm almost done. Is my screen being shared? Yes, it is. And then there's the slideshow. Bingo. Will you tell me, Jody, when you want me to advance? I'm going to mute myself and probably go off camera, but I'll be here if you need me.
Okay. So thank you all for having me today. And as Dr. Schwartz said, I'll be doing a presentation on how we as researchers and as scientists can also advocate. And here is where I'm coming from in this research. Although I'm a law professor, I also have my PhD in communicative studies. I research how law affects people's lives, and I've done diverse issues such as how and where do people experience closure following execution and murder? How does terrorism affect the populations in a city around a particular area in which the terrorism occurs? How do fertility patients use emotion to make decisions, particularly in relationships with caregivers? And most recently, I've been researching what's called fertility fraud, which is the interesting issue of what happens when doctors use their own sperm to inseminate patients without their knowledge or consent. In the 1970s, they told their patients that, in fact, they would get sperm from a medical resident resembling the husband, or they would use the husband's sperm. And unfortunately, that did not happen, and individuals found out later with direct-to-consumer genetic testing that their parents' fertility doctor was actually their biological father as well. And so I have helped to pass about 10 state laws related to this. In California, had one before. I've worked most directly in Indiana, Texas, Colorado, Florida, Arizona, Kentucky. We passed Ohio at 3:30 a.m. this morning. And these bills generally expand who can sue for fertility fraud. For example, the children born from these procedures, as well as the couples that underwent fertility treatment. And they provide for both a civil and criminal cause of action. In some states, they state that this conduct is sexual assault. And we also have a federal bill, which is H.R. 1806, which is due to go up in January, at the end of January. And so we feel that it's important to pass these laws, both to allow people to sue and seek accountability from physicians, and to put this on the map in terms of, how law regulates technology. And there are several other technological issues that fall through gaps. But I thought this was a good example of doing research and doing advocacy at the same time. I came into this issue actually in about 2019, because I was asked after the prosecution of a doctor in Indianapolis named Dr. Donald Klein to help them pass a state law. The victims pass a state law in Indiana, and that was the first state that passed the fertility fraud law in the country. I worked with victims to do this, and in the process of doing advocacy, I actually started to do research. So it was kind of backwards in that situation. I continue to do both advocacy and research. They run side by side. And I do similar projects with respect to firearms and Second Amendment and also abortion. But fertility fraud is the easiest one for me to talk about. I've been very deeply steeped in it since 2017. So I think we can advance. So why would we advocate? Sometimes our field of inquiry actually implies an advocacy position. For example, we might be conservation biologists, we might be in medicine. And there's this assumption that certain professions, explicitly medical professions, are calling upon their members to become advocates. For example, pediatricians have become very instrumental in the fight against gun violence, and proponents of safe storage, telling patients, for example, how to safely store firearms. We might do research from the get-go. We might choose a project to affect a particular change in the world, or we might find that our research conclusions from certain projects support or oppose policy outcomes. Some call this action research, and this does run counter to what science traditionally is, what neutrality traditionally is, what objectivity traditionally is. But especially since society has become very divisive over social issues in particular, we're actually confronted by a tension. We're asked to be both responsive to social concerns as researchers, or social risks as researchers. If we're not, our work is irrelevant. We might not qualify for funding. But we're also asked to retain the authority of objective, value-free, and rigorous scientists or professionals. And so we're becoming increasingly aware as well that disciplines are embedded within external pressures. There's social pressures, funding priorities, policy interventions. And increasingly, professors are becoming known as public intellectuals as well. Meanwhile, science is still thought of by the public, and sometimes even by practitioners, as this kind of objective, cold, nonpartisan, value-neutral enterprise. And whereas advocacy, of course, is this very subjective, warm, passionate enterprise. And so there's often a belief that scientists do facts and advocates do values. But there's also been tension in the past between the non-scientist's ability to access information. And, for example, to become part of this debate on a reasonably informed basis. Either this information was not made publicly available, or it was thought not to be understandable to lay individuals. But now there's a drive to open access publications. Lay science literacy is increasing, as are lay research movements, and the lines between research and advocacy are blurring. So I think we're ready to advance. So when we're thinking about advocacy, we think about 4 key questions. What do we want to change? How do we want to change it? What assets do we have in order to create change? And what obstacles might there be to hinder our ability to create change? And some examples of this, the problem might come from our research. It might be a social problem. It might be a problem that attracts funding. And we're going to have to choose a particular goal we want. Is it a research study that's going to give us more information about potential solutions? Is it packaging our conclusions in order to affect legislation or to pass a law, pass a policy, change policies, change the conversation? What assets do we have to create change? Well, that could obviously be our research, that could be our position, our credentials, that could be our institution. It also could be our ties with community organizations or a knowledge of how things work in a particular field. It could be the ability of our research to attract money, not only funding dollars, but also community dollars to work with nonprofits, etc. What obstacles are there to hinder change? Well, sometimes we are our own obstacle. Sometimes we are just sort of stuck in this mentality where we see ourselves as within the academic field, and it's very difficult for us to step outside of ourselves and become advocates. Other times, an issue might be very political, and we might be afraid for accusations of bias, for example. The easiest issues are ones where few people can disagree that there's a problem and things need to change. And so, for example, fertility fraud is sort of an ideal issue from that standpoint, because no one thinks that doctors should ever defraud patients. And it's very easy to argue that these doctors should be held accountable and measures put in place so that this does not happen again. Next slide. So again, just digging a little deeper into some of these questions. How do you want to affect change? We might want to stop or start a particular policy. We might want to have our research recommendations accepted. We might want to change or facilitate public knowledge, or we just might want to get an issue on the agenda in the first place. That was really the case with fertility fraud because no one had ever heard of it. And we've gotten to the point where, you know, almost the world has heard of it now through either state laws or through mechanisms such as the Netflix documentary Our Father, in which I was the legal expert. Next slide. In terms of assets to create change, this might be, again, research data. There might be relevance. So relevance is an asset. Certain things, whether it's from crises, for example, all of these vaccine scholars that I knew rejoiced because they got to do vaccine studies that were relevant or explain to politicians how to increase public uptake of vaccines when the vaccination question became more relevant through COVID-19. Maybe there's a new solution on the horizon. There's sudden support from opinion leaders or policymakers around an issue. Sometimes this is a temporal matter, you know, a legislative session, for example, and sometimes there's just money out there that somebody is throwing at a problem in order to solve it. Next slide. In terms of obstacles, again, it might be strong opponents, value conflicts, lack of public support or knowledge, and just lack of access to policy making. And all of these things, we're going to talk about how to overcome them. Next slide. So in terms of digging a little deeper and beginning to map an advocacy project, we're going to run into 5 key needs. The first is gauging a perceived need or interest for action. The second is understanding who the actors, stakeholders, and action centers surrounding an issue might be. Understanding current perspectives and positions, how decisions are made is also a key thing to understand, and just the importance of getting timing right. And again, to insert our advocacy, insert our research at the correct time. Next slide. So in terms of gauging perceived need or interest, questions that are relevant are, is this issue on somebody's agenda? Who is talking about it? Or is this something that we're going to have to say, here's a problem and here's why this is a problem? It's easier if there's interest and momentum behind an issue. Is someone acting on it? Is there another group out there who is doing something that you do not think is sound, that you're opposing? And I think a couple are copied and pasted twice. So next slide. Another key issue is mapping actors, stakeholders, and what I call action centers or community organizations or institutions that might be very key to advocacy for a particular issue. So who are the main stakeholders? Who makes decisions? Who influences the decision makers? Where do these things happen? Or do they happen, for example, in a combination of community organization? Is this something that happens in academia? Is this something that happens in the legislative body? And what mechanisms, right? Is it floor speeches? Are there particular bills that are introduced? Are there policies that are floated? How public are these materials? And in what networks are these individuals, organizations, and processes embedded? Next slide. So in terms of understanding current perspectives and positions, this is really the values and interests question. This might involve staking out the level of consensus or conflict on target issues. And for example, maybe there's conflict over whether an issue is important at all. Maybe it's salient just for a particular group. Why are these interests and values at stake? What do others stand to lose or gain? For example, money, opportunity, access, power. And how do you fit within this landscape? Are you getting money to research a particular issue? Do you have particular kinds of power or access? Do you have particular kinds of knowledge? And it might be that you're coming from a position where you have none of these things. You don't have money, opportunity, access, or power. And we're going to talk about the importance of research alliances or community engaged research, for example, to overcome these lacks. Next slide. We have to understand the decision-making process in great detail. So there might be forums that look like they're the decision-making forum, for example, legislative hearings, but maybe the decisions are really made through informal processes that are not accessible to the public or to us, even as researchers. And again, we have to evaluate our own access and understanding of these processes as well. Next slide. Getting the timing right is really a key element. It's essential. Why would we want, for example, to get involved in a legislative process when the legislature doesn't meet for months and we need to solve a problem right now? So we need to change our advocacy strategy. So what is the timing of key decision-making processes? Maybe it's around an election cycle, again, a legislative session, crises. Maybe there's been new developments in technology, and so there's regulatory movement going on. What stages are needed to get a proposal or information into the decision-making process? So, for example, for legislative sessions, you really need to start the summer before the legislative session starts in January, and at the latest by October, unless something is really current and crops up in between very close to the start of the legislative session. You have to look how long you have to effect change and how ready will you be to take advantage of the opening. In other words, this is very important to placing ourselves on a spectrum where we can accomplish a great deal if we have a lot of time, obviously, or if we have things ready to go. But we might want to choose very specific niche goals if we really don't have that much time. We really have to strike quickly. Next slide. So when we look at three issues in particular, again, the first of which is mapping current thinking, I'd like to dig a little bit deeper on this issue. So how do stakeholders define the problem? How is the problem or discussion framed? Is it framed as a political issue, a healthcare issue, human rights, etc.? What language is commonly used? And this is really, if you listen to policyholders, policymakers, stakeholders, etc., when do they talk about this? In what terms? And are those terms that are similar to your research? Can you make use of that? What solutions are discussed? How have actors come to understand or derived thinking on an issue? Perhaps interest groups are lobbying. Perhaps they're reading information in the newspaper. And how can you frame your contribution within these factors? How can you be a source from which people derive current thinking? How can you pose solutions? How can you perhaps change the language by which people refer to an issue? How can you contribute to how the problem or discussion is framed or change it? How can you become a stakeholder that helps to define the problem? Next slide. One of these, another issue basically is digging deeper in mapping decision-making. And this really is more of a strategy question. When you go to figure out, which we'll talk about in a moment, what you're going to do, how you're going to do it. Who's going to be more easily convinced by what arguments? Are there particular legislators you need to target? Are there particular community leaders you need to target? Are there opinion leaders that are so essential to the issue that you need to get them on board? How entrenched are actors in their current positions? Is this an issue that they're malleable? Are other factors, again, values or interests such as religion, such as demographics, are those affecting how actors respond to a particular issue? An example of this, which we've seen over and over again, is abortion, right? So actors tend to be very entrenched in their current positions if they are conservative, if they are religious. How can actors be moved? Is it going to take visual evidence, visual depictions of statistics? Is it going to be anecdotes? Will you have to appear, give a presentation, or bring perhaps a victim or someone affected by the issue to the actor who can change policy? And how achievable are different advocacy objectives, sort of in this culture of decision making? Next slide. So before we go in and talk more about the actual strategy or advocacy itself, there are some very important preliminary questions. The first is, are we going to go in alone or as part of a team? If so, is the team relationship going to be public? Is this sort of a research alliance that you're going to announce? Or are individuals just going to coordinate sort of independently of each other? Is this going to be an issue where it's useful to partner with organizations? One of the best strategies we found, for example, in state law and passing fertility fraud laws, we ally with an organization that already has certain resources which we lack or which we might lack, for example, lobbyist services. And so when we passed the fertility fraud law in Ohio recently, we went in with an adoption organization, actually. Do we have diverse capacities and resources? And again, that's another reason to work as part of a team, because everybody can bring something different to the table. What roles will the members of the team fill? One good potential partnership might be members of an existing research team. Are there community coalitions we can build? Often the team building is a long-term project. It's very rare that a sort of team coalesces around an issue and you can jump right in. Next slide. Another very important goal at the outset is just realizing the various stages to influence. So the first is that the audience will recognize and understand your ideas, evidence, and options. The second is that the audience starts to become interested and get engaged. The third is that the audience becomes convinced. Fourth, they will make their ideas their own. Literally, this happens in legislation as legislative allies of yours take your idea, put it into a bill, and sponsor it. Literally, making it their bill on the floor. And finally, the last stage is that they act on proposals. They agree to a solution. They implement the solution. That's the ultimate stage of success. Next slide. Another key thing that's very interesting and important to keep in mind, academics have a very fundamental world view difference from policymakers. So academics might be theoretical, objective, and universal. They question the fundamentals of policy. They often lack knowledge of practical constraints, and they may talk in terms that are not easy to understand. Policymakers, on the other hand, are very practical, political, and context-driven. They're resistant to change. They might just go with what works, even if it's not the best solution. They're driven by budget and capacity and cycles. And they talk in this sort of bureaucratic budgetary language often, particularly legislators. Next slide. So when it actually comes time to deriving advocacy activities, we want to make it clear that we're not going to be focused on recounting our research conclusions, but on how best to engage audiences. We want, in other words, to get our research to audiences through dialogue. We have to be persistent and consistent in our messaging, and might be for months or years. We need to have both quick syntheses of key points and deep dives into areas of interest. We need to have a mix of carrots and sticks for our audiences, incentives to pay attention, what will happen if there's no action on an issue. And I think we have to represent our research conclusions fairly, neutrally, without stretching or overreaching. So yes, thank you. With audience values and priorities differing, we might look at a variety of events. Importantly, these are going to be both within and outside organizations. For example, the organization in which we're trying to affect change, whether it be an industry or a legislature, and outside through the media. Papers or articles, briefings, presentations, media events. Often these activities are sequenced in stages. For example, we may publish an article to lay the foundation and then bring or translate that to the public and to policymakers through websites and talks. Often I think of this as doing waves of advocacy. Like the first wave might be publication of an article. The second might be, taking that and making sure it gets before some key policymakers, that kind of thing. Next slide. Note that the effective advocacy project begins during the research process itself, or often begins. It's great if you have this in mind at the outset to involve policymakers in research to get feedback on design, even analysis, because again, there might be things, since you're not part of that community, which they can help you interpret. You can design research questions that will be relevant to that community, easy to translate into policy. This builds legitimacy and relevancy. It starts dialogue and it encourages these policymakers and stakeholders to take ownership in the research process. Next slide. Now, of course, there are risks in engagement. There is the risk that opponents will react negatively. It might affect your reputation in the academy. There is a risk that your messages will be skewed or taken out of context, used for political gain. There might be political consequences, and there's, unfortunately, one very important thing I'm thinking of here, which is in the abortion context, Attorney General Rokita going after Dr. Caitlin Bernard for allegations that she actually betrayed HIPAA principles, or that she breached confidentiality. And so there might be an opponent out there of yours that is so opposed in practice and in principle to what you stand for. And again, that abortion issue is central to this conversation, that that individual is going to try to go after you on a personal level, or use their office to sort of exploit weaknesses that you may have. And so it can get actually very, very unpleasant. There might be irrational responses out there. People might ask you to defend your research or challenge your credibility. So it's very important to anticipate opposition and strategically plan responses to that. Next slide. Again, there are a few other risks, most of which I talked about on the previous slide: legal action, professional disciplinary consequences, opposition from political sources, etc. Next slide. And so here are some tips just to round out the talk for engaging as advocates. Know that it's not just talking, but it's also listening. Acknowledge that we have both a citizen hat that we wear and a researcher or a scientist hat, and we have to be clear which one is on in given moments. It's very important to have realistic expectations, or else we tend to burn out as advocates. It's important to pick audiences carefully and think about how those audiences are related to, different from, similar to other audiences. It's important to know what your audience expects or can be expected to understand. For example, it's really not the thing to bring your research article to a public gathering and hand it out. It's going to be much easier to translate those in the form of a few, boiled down points that an audience can understand and from which they can move on and discuss what's important. There's a boundary between scientific issues and value judgments to which we need to be sensitive as advocates. And we have to know our limits. Maybe we're very good at certain things, not good at others, very comfortable with certain contexts, not with others. And I think here, staying within our limits, and again, partnering with others who do what we do not feel, who can do what we either cannot access or do not feel comfortable with, might be the best strategy. Slide. Again, how we frame issues is very important. Metaphors, analogies, anecdotes, translating this message into different forms. The soundbite that's 30 seconds, the 2 to 3 minute testimony, the longer public address or lecture. Building trust and being transparent are also important. And again, that just involves not overstating research conclusions, being honest, and being upfront too about your credentials and the limits of your expertise. And I believe that that is the last slide. So with that, we can turn to discussion.
Thanks, Jody. That was just great. Really appreciate that in so many ways. People should just go ahead and put the hand up with their reaction, and I'll call on them, or Jody, you're welcome to do it. I should say, I'll just start out just because I don't see any hands yet, but just to give people time to start. I'm expecting, again, these talks generally are supposed to be 30 minutes, so bingo, first of all. And secondly, I suspect we can fill up the rest of the time. We'll take as much time as we need for the rest of the hour as needed to talk about experiences and thoughts about this, because you laid out a beautiful primer, I'm going to call it, of how to be an advocate in science. I wondered if, just to reflect on the points you made, you talked about dangers, and those were very well taken. I think they're very real. But I also wondered whether you would think about, as a researcher who's doing something which starts to feel like advocacy, when is it unethical? Like when are those, where are those guide rails we should be thinking of as we're stepping over the line, maybe, where we're not just worried about practical dangers or political or say funding, which is of course a concern in medical research, especially perhaps, but everything. But also, like, when are we making a mistake? Like when have we, what sort of mistakes might we make where on reflection just about our own work, we might consider our work to be unethical?
Mm-hmm. Certainly, I think if we violate bioethics, if we violate accepted ethical norms, if we coerce subjects, if we contrive results, I think that's obviously the glaring answer. I think to me that otherwise this is very much a gut question, because we have personal ethics and professional ethics. Of course, as a researcher, for example, and a lawyer, I cannot file a frivolous lawsuit to see people's reactions when a lawsuit is filed. So I may breach professional norms. That is obviously unethical. But also I could violate something that I hold to be sacred. For example, if I gain access to a particular policymaker or opinion leader by misrepresenting my stance or misrepresenting who I am, why I am there, I think that starts to feel pretty icky. One of my ethical lines in fertility fraud basically is in how I will conduct research and advocacy. And this is actually a really good question, because one ethical violation might be choosing a research or advocacy goal that is too broad, if that makes sense. So if I list as my goal in fertility fraud advocacy to help victims hold doctors accountable, right, then I am prioritizing helping them bring lawsuits, helping them talk to the media. But if I choose holding perpetrators accountable and getting individuals to recognize the harms that they did as harms, that's going to list a different set of priorities for me. An example is when, I was passing these state laws trying to expand opportunities for victims to sue and obtain accountability. And then I was contacted by an insurance company who represented one of these physicians for malpractice purposes. And they wanted to retain me as a consultant to explain why what the doctor did was wrong. I was happy to do that, because that furthered my objective of communicating to the public and to policymakers why fertility fraud was a violation. But I did that at the expense of costing victims damages, because they could have sued the doctor and the insurance would have paid the judgment if the insurance company was wrong. So I had to make a choice between my goal and between actually helping victims get money.
Outstanding answer. I love your answer. I love that in this modern day where we're relativists about so many things, that if you follow what you're going to call, I guess, the principles of science, of doing good, careful scientific research, then you're well immunized from the what you said against the charge that you're being unethical, even though you are motivated perhaps by a certain perspective on political or social issues. Colin.
Right.
Hi, thank you. I enjoyed that. My question, so you had mentioned, my question is, thinking about people who are maybe not a part of the communities that they're advocating for, I'm wondering, because it's a huge skill set and not all of us have it. And, some of us are maybe currently trying to build that, those capacities, but don't have them yet. I was wondering if you could talk at all about how you know when to step back, when you're not the person to be the advocate, what your role could be then to still be supportive, but not to be like the face of a movement.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And I think it's important to know our preferences, our strengths and weaknesses, even before we get involved in a particular advocacy project. So some of us are comfortable talking to the media, others are not. Some are comfortable with longer presentations in front of professionals. Others really like community engagement. So for those who are not the face of the organization or the face of the advocacy movement, there's still very, very important work to be done, work connecting individuals. For example, maybe you have connections that others do not, or you're in charge of making sure that everyone's on the same page before you go in with your community partners to give testimony. So there's that coordination or networking effect. There might be technological materials to develop, websites. There might be issue papers or white papers to develop. And so I think just the sheer scope of translation and adaptation to different audiences, calls for a team with varying and diverse talents and capacities. It also is the case too that we're very busy around certain times of the semester. So for example, maybe your schedule is a little bit more flexible at certain times, whereas someone who has been a dedicated researcher, a dedicated advocate, their schedule suddenly changes so that they're swamped during the legislative session, and you can pick that up. So I think it's as diverse as the research projects you might be engaged in, but there's certainly a number of roles besides just that front person who's sort of the spokesperson of the advocacy. Kristen?
Hi, my name is Kristen Story. I'm one of the neonatologists, and my question is more sort of on the legal aspects of things. So, as an IU employee and wanting to advocate for a certain cause, where does that put you in terms of needing approvals to be able to put yourself out there in that role for a certain cause, or doing that without tying that to your appointment in some way, and what kind of repercussions could come of something like that? It can be dicey. And so just wondering how to sort of handle that within the context of our employment.
Yes, and I think that's going to be a question that has diverse answers depending on what position you occupy. Are you part of administration? Are you a professor? Are you a researcher? Meaning a professor who teaches and researches? Are you just a research professor or a research scientist? And so there's no official university policy requiring us to go, for example, to IU administration and say, this is what I'm doing. We do have policies on the ground at IU that suggest that, for example, we get approval, we clear things with the legislative or general counsel. I have actually never done that, but when I testify at the legislature, I always testify in my individual capacity, which is, again, something we're advised to do as members of IU. I think also what we are doing matters. So if we're, and again, this might be a reflection of what position somebody is in. So here in Bloomington, if a member or the president, let's say, of the Bloomington Faculty Council sends a message out to the faculty, let's just go with abortion, that says the abortion issue is affecting the student body in certain ways, right? That might be taken as an institutional message, whereas if that person went to a rally or went to testify against or for an abortion-related bill, that would not be seen as quite the level of institutional action. So I think that that is actually one of the most challenging and potentially dangerous concerns we have, because we do have numerous examples just this year of individuals that have politicized issues and gone professionally after, I would say, professionals employed by IU, such as Attorney General Rokita and Dr. Bernard, and continues to pursue these, even when they've been cleared by the institution as having done nothing wrong. So I think that if we do have any doubt, it is important to go through, for example, the Institutional Review Board, talk to subject advocacy experts here at CTSI, talk to the General Counsel of IU if we're really, really concerned. But then again, there's always a school of it's easier to ask forgiveness instead of permission as well. And so everything we do involves risk, particularly with some issues that are out there today.
I'll comment on this too. There was an email from the school about getting clearance for making statements. And I think all of us have to talk to our administration. I was talking to my chair about, what sort of things would be considered out of line. It seems to me, it's my personal opinion. I'll say what I think we should always say, which is this is me as a person. I hold a role here, but I'm a guest. I'm a host, I guess, of this meeting. But I will say as a person that, if I'm very clear, like you were saying, Jody, the example you gave was a person who seems to be speaking for the university. And that must always be clearly conveyed, more than just maybe with a comment at the beginning. Say, like, I'm speaking to you as Peter Schwartz with professional experiences, but I would keep speaking as my own views. And if you can make that clear, I would hope we can all speak loudly in the public square. But again, just like you said, we are an institution. We have to negotiate with our bosses and the administration about what is appropriate. And I guess you could probably tell us a lot about the law of this if it comes down to things like professional censure or perhaps things affecting employment. I assume there's a whole body of law, which again, as an ethicist and doctor, I don't know about. So we do look to you and the lawyers to help us as we explore those things. Initially, I would hope with conversation and understanding that there are important issues we wish to comment on, and we hope we haven't lost our freedom to do that because of our employment.
And I thank God that we do not practice, that we do not teach, that we do not research right now in a state such as those that have put restrictions on what faculty members can say on particular issues. For example, I as a professor could say, if you need help affecting reproductive rights, please come see me in my office and I will help you. And this is the only way I can address students is through either an institutional mechanism like email, an institutional forum like class. And I took that risk. That is a risk that others did not feel comfortable taking. And at least in one context, there was a professor up in Notre Dame that has faced a great deal of censure from the public in terms of her advocacy related to this issue. But again, the university has stepped up and said, no, these are issues of academic freedom. We are supporting this professor. So it's important, I think, to keep your institution informed for purposes of support, as well as, knowing the boundaries. Frank?
Beautiful answer. Frank. Frank, you're on mute if you are speaking. You are still on mute. While we wait for Frank to start talking as soon as you can. There you are. You're back.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm kind of the dinosaur in the room. I'm 76 years old, or I will be in a week or so. And I grew up in Bloomington. I lived at 631 East 3rd, which is right next to the law school. And Peter invited me to this via the internet, but I did the original work with Dr. Gary Peck at the NIH on what became well known as Accutane. And I guess there's two questions. I really have many questions, but one, and you may not know the answer, does a pharmaceutical company, when they're putting forth a medication in the United States, are they obliged to give you all their information so that you make safe decisions? That's number one. Does anyone know the answer to that?
I think that under FDA regulations, first of all, they it depends on what's meant by you. They have to turn a lot of things over to the FDA that the public will never see. But in terms of the package inserts and things, they have to, it's pretty much the informed consent standard as I understand it. Material risks, benefits, side effects, and just not every bit of information. But certainly written at an 8th grade level, certainly the minority.
I'm talking really about investigational drug brochures that they had and
Mhm.
gave me actually just one, and had very minimal information in it. Treated 30 human patients, just not to treat them, to see what the side effects were.
Mhm.
And that's all I received. Then we find out that they actually use the medication in Europe and it caused birth defects, so they stopped using it.
Mhm.
Now, to put this in relevant terms for you, this goes back to the first acne patient we saw was Dr. Tony Fauci's patient on infectious disease, a young girl about 17 who had the worst acne I have ever seen. And he wanted us to try our medication on her, and it worked wonderfully. The birth defect question never came up really
Mhm.
in real terms until it was out on the market in 1982. It came out in August, and you take 9 to 12 months from that, and there were like between 60 and 16,000 birth defects recorded, according to the newspapers.
Yes, I think I have a relevant analogy as well. And that's there's a couple of sterilization measures that for example, non-surgical. One was eSure. eSure was a device that doctors inserted in their offices into fallopian tubes that cause scar tissue, and within 3 to 6 months, it would affect infertility. And of course, this was wonderful for a lot of people. And I think that to broaden the scope of what you're saying, beyond the industry and the regulatory agency like the FDA, this is where I think research and advocacy starts to cross with some of the lesser, the not so appealing aspects of law. So we might think that, for example, it's important as researchers to advocate for or against a product like Accutane or eSure if we know patients are getting hurt or if we know patients are benefited. But then there's this whole other culture which is going on where personal injury lawyers get involved. They create Facebook groups and they start malpractice suits or start to get claims from individuals. They drive claims to the FDA that were never brought beforehand, and they sort of warp this advocacy process in key ways for their own material gain, of course, to effectuate lawsuits. So I think we're seeing that quite a bit, and that is an ethical issue. That is it's one of those obstacles I think that people have to know about when they do research in this field, and it's going to be a particularly difficult force to counter because, again, these lawyers have a very significant financial stake in those activities, and it's going to be hard to actually insert yourself and have a fair and free conversation, for example, about a product like Accutane or eSure. Peter, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I was going to say, first of all, Frank, you sent me an email. I know I haven't responded yet, but I'm happy to respond today, and we can have a conversation. It sounds like it's important information you're bringing forth. I don't know about the history of Accutane at all, and we could focus on that maybe when I go with you offline. But I do think it's an interesting issue you raised, Frank. I assume you're talking about things that maybe you had access to as a researcher that were then being misrepresented or not adequately represented, in your opinion, to the public. And I can see that being a case, like you're saying, it's appropriate to bring it up here. It's a matter of advocacy, I think, of you want to be an advocate, but you have access maybe to things that maybe for legal reasons you can't disclose, at least back then, Frank. Do you have people come to you with this issue of advocacy, Jody? Do you confront it? Is there law there or ethics there? I will say some of these questions that are coming up become very complicated in the real life, very specific cases. And there's of course
Right.
cases when you should call through the BSAP program, advertisement,
Yes.
disclosure, call a person like Jody who's available as a consultant, throughout the CTSI, but at Bloomington, and call the BSAP program here. We have lawyers too, as well as ethics people to help you navigate this. But I'll stop. I could tell you some stories, but I'll stop there.
One issue that does come to mind that was brought to my attention, a journalist brought a device called the Bridge device to my attention. Bridge device was a neurostimulation device that mounted behind the ear. There are numerous issues with an article that had been published in a substance use journal that basically made this medical experimentation. In addition, financial incentives that one of the authors had were not disclosed. And this was very troubling. And the further we dug, the more issues there were with the article. And I think that was a particularly interesting advocacy point, because it was almost one particular very specialized type of advocacy, which is almost being a whistleblower. And so if you become aware of wrongdoing, you can bring it to somebody's attention, bring it to the journal's attention, bring it to the FDA's attention, bring it to a governing body's attention, et cetera, go to the media. And again, it's in these contexts that it's very important to look out for your own protections as well. Look very carefully at the risks and the boundaries you might have. And sometimes the best way to do advocacy is anonymously as well.
Is my hand up? I'm not
Yes.
sure. The thing about, I did try to bring attention to it. The Washington Post sent a reporter to my office in Ohio, and it was on the first page of the Washington Post. I think I sent you a copy, Peter. And this has obviously bothered me for 25 to 30 years. And it's kind of has been over since they put this I Pledge program in, which is very complicated for physicians and dermatologists to use. The other thing I'd like to comment on is the risk. Hoffman LaRoche, which is a pharmaceutical company that brought out Accutane, took me to federal court. And although I won, I lost. I lost emotionally. I lost about $400,000 to $500,000. I mean, it was, to them, that's nothing. To me, that was a tremendous amount. I couldn't even get my wife to come and sit in the back of the room. And they had 10 lawyers at a desk, and I had my one lawyer who couldn't hardly hold a book still because he was so nervous. But there are risks to what you do. Sometimes you don't understand them. And I kind of pushed their button a little bit, because I quite honestly felt that there might be physical harm according to what was taking place at phone calls to my wife and so forth. It's a long story. I was going to write a book. My lawyer said, "You want to go back to federal court?" I said, "No." And then I kind of let it lie. And that's where I am. So that I just want to, I don't have really expect an answer, but I just want everyone to know there is a risk. The risk can be great, and how great it is, no one really knows sometimes.
Yes, yes. And sometimes there are risks to not doing anything too. I do believe that sometimes those individuals that step forward and advocate, or again, it's particularly in the whistleblower context, they often end up materially poor off. But they, at the end of it all, might be able to live with themselves. It's for every one of us to weigh those costs and whether we can do that, whether that's in our capability or not.
So thanks again, Frank, for your comments in the story. Again, let me go respond to your email. I'm sorry, I haven't yet. Joy, can I say one thing just to maybe help cap this off?
Sure.
I know we have only a couple of minutes, so I do want to end on time. But you said something in the middle where I kind of giggled and kind of smiled and was happy because you talked about how science, is supposed to be sort of expect to be value free. And of course, we've lived through now a few years where that's hard to convince people of that, a certain segment of our population for sure. And it's almost quaint. That's why I kind of smiled. Is that still sort of a thing, would you say, in the advocacy world where you are coming as a person of science, bringing the facts? Of course, a lot of us still feel that way. Or is that something where now you're just sort of seen as another member of the scrum, with policy goals? Or is it somewhere in between? Or how do you think about that when you think of advocacy and being a researcher?
I think you have to maintain very tight lines about where you go and what you do. And for example, if I speak to the media, there are things that or types of things I will say, types of things I absolutely would not say. And I want to both represent my own research and my own perspectives and my own expertise. And but at the same time, I have to acknowledge at points that my own personal beliefs and values, and I try to always be clear about when, again, those personal values and beliefs are affecting or even standing in place of my research conclusions. One of the individuals that I wanted just to recognize here who did a marvelous moment of advocacy during the Senate hearings on SB1, the Indiana abortion bill, is Dr. Mary Ott. And she got up and testified very succinctly, very matter-of-factly, and put a great deal of passion into these into statistics on why abortion was a healthcare issue, why it was necessary to protect abortion rights in the state of Indiana. And I think her comments galvanized those that came after and set a very, very high floor for the kinds of rigorous yet very human forms of advocacy that we can engage in. I think that was certainly an example that I have used many times in front of my classes and will continue to.
Bravo, Mary. Do you wish to respond?
Sorry, thank you. I have to say, though, the one thing that really was painful throughout the whole thing is I was testifying as an Indiana pediatrician on behalf of the Academy of Pediatrics. And I could not use my IU Health anything. I wore a white coat to identify myself as a physician and put an I stand with kids button on top of my Riley symbol so that I wouldn't be identified as part of IU. So it was, it was just very interesting, the piece of it where I really had to just divorce myself from my professional role as an IU faculty member.
And it just goes to show how many professional roles and professional hats we can wear in these efforts.
Well, it's 3, so now that we're getting to the really good stuff, we'll end. And again, thank you, Jody, for the presentation. Really appreciate it. I think it's really topical topic. And again, people who are facing these questions, which I think are everywhere, please feel free to consult with the BSAP program, Bioethics, and actually now it's the BPAP program, Participant Advocacy. And we're accessible through the webpage that I think there's a link in the invitation. And also, of course, to us individually, Dr. Ott is one of our faculty, as am I, and Dr. Madeira, as well as others. So thank you for being here. We'll have this posted online with maybe, usually put some reading with it too on our treats pages. And again, we hope to see you all again. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.